Every October 31st, across America, something ancient awakens. Children dress as ghosts and goblins. Jack-o'-lanterns flicker on doorsteps. The air fills with whispers of the supernatural. We call it Halloween, a night of candy and costumes, harmless fun. But what if I told you that beneath this innocent celebration lies a truth the Vatican has guarded for nearly 2,000 years? Deep within the Vatican's secret archives, behind doors sealed with locks older than nations, past corridors where even cardinals dare not tread, there exists a collection of documents the Church has never wanted the world to see. Manuscripts written in languages most have forgotten. Scrolls describing rituals that predate Christianity itself. Evidence of a spiritual power so potent, so undeniable, that its very existence threatened everything the Church was built upon. Tonight, we're going to explore what the Vatican fears you'll discover about Halloween. This isn't a story about demons or devils. Those, the Church can explain. This is about something far more dangerous to their narrative, the truth about where Halloween really came from, and why that truth was systematically erased from history. You see, Halloween wasn't always about trick-or-treating. It wasn't always harmless. 2,000 years ago, on this exact night, something extraordinary happened. The ancient Celts believed that on October 31st, the boundary between our world and the realm beyond grew thin as gossamer. Not metaphorically, actually thin, measurably thin, and they had rituals, precise, calculated, powerful, to navigate that threshold. The Druids, those mysterious priests of the Celtic world, possessed knowledge that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. They understood cycles of energy, cosmic alignments, the very fabric of consciousness itself. And on Samhain, the festival we now call Halloween, they wielded that knowledge in ways that would change human destiny. Then Rome arrived. Then Christianity spread. And slowly, methodically, with the precision of master architects, the Church began to rewrite history. They couldn't destroy Halloween. It was too deeply rooted in the human soul. So they did something far more clever. They transformed it. November 1st became All Saints' Day. The vigil before it, October 31st, became All Hallows' Eve. Same date, same seasonal power, but a completely different story wrapped around it. What was lost in that transformation? That's what we're here to uncover. Because scattered throughout history, in documents the Vatican thought destroyed, in traditions that refused to die, in symbols hidden in plain sight, the original truth survived. And when you piece it together, something remarkable emerges. Not a story of devil worship, as the Church would have you believe, but something far more revolutionary, evidence that ancient peoples possess spiritual knowledge, direct access to realms of power, without needing priests as intermediaries. Can you see why that was dangerous? If every person could access the sacred directly, if the veil between worlds truly thinned on specific nights, if ancient rituals actually worked, then what need was there for a church? What justification for its authority? What claim to exclusive truth? None. So the knowledge was suppressed, the Druids were silenced, the texts were locked away, and a beautiful, terrifying, powerful festival was reduced to costumes and candy. But here's what they couldn't erase. Every time you carve a jack-o'-lantern, you're practicing a Celtic ritual of protective fire magic. Every time you dress in costume on Halloween, you're using an ancient technique to move between worlds undetected. Every time you speak to the dead, even playfully, on this night, you're acknowledging something the Church spent centuries trying to make you forget, that the veil is real, that the power is real, that your ancestors knew things we've been taught to dismiss. So before we begin this journey together, let me ask you something. If what I'm about to share resonates with you, if you've always felt there was something more to Halloween than what we've been told, do me a favor, subscribe to this channel, because this story is just the beginning. There are so many other truths hidden in the holidays we celebrate, the traditions we practice, the beliefs we've inherited, and together we're going to uncover them all. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because once you see what's been hidden, you can't unsee it, and trust me, you'll want to see what comes next. Now, settle in. Close your eyes if you can. Let your mind drift back past shopping malls and plastic decorations, back past centuries of carefully constructed lies, back to a time when fire was sacred, when night held power, and when October 31st meant something that would make the Vatican tremble. Our story begins not in Rome, not in a cathedral, but in the ancient forests of Ireland, where druids gathered beneath darkening skies, and the year was about to turn, where the veil was about to thin, and where a truth was about to be born that 2,000 years of suppression still couldn't kill. This is what the Vatican hides about Halloween, and you're about to discover why they were so desperate to keep it secret. Let's begin. Ireland, October 31st, approximately 2,000 years ago. Picture this: darkness falling early over rolling green hills, the kind of darkness that feels alive, that presses against your skin like cold water. No electric lights, no street lamps, just the glow of enormous bonfires cutting through the black, their flames reaching toward a sky thick with stars you've never seen. This is Samhain, pronounced Samhain, and tonight, everything changes. The Celtic people who gathered around these fires weren't celebrating what we'd call a holiday. They were marking something far more significant, the hinge of the year itself. October 31st was the last day of the Celtic calendar. November 1st was the first day of their new year, and the night between, this night, existed in a state of suspension, a night that belonged to neither the old year nor the new, a night when normal rules didn't apply. The Celts understood something that modern science is only beginning to rediscover, that time is not uniform, that certain moments hold more potential than others, that transitions, thresholds, edges, boundaries are where power concentrates, and Samhain was the ultimate threshold. Think about it. Summer dying into winter, harvest ending, darkness beginning, the life-giving season surrendering to the season of death. In the Celtic worldview, this wasn't just a meteorological shift. It was a cosmic event. The wheel of the year was turning, and in that turn, something extraordinary happened. The veil between worlds grew thin. Now, before you dismiss this as poetic metaphor, consider what the Celts actually observed. Animals behaving strangely in late October, the quality of light changing, the way sound carried differently in the cooling air. Dreams becoming more vivid, intuitions sharpening, the boundary between waking and sleeping feeling permeable. They didn't have our vocabulary for electromagnetic fields, for geomagnetic activity, for the measurable ways that seasonal transitions affect human consciousness. But they noticed the effects, and they built an entire spiritual technology around them. The Druids, the Celtic priest class, the keepers of sacred knowledge, had spent generations mapping these patterns. They knew that on Samhain night, communication with the spirit world wasn't just possible, it was easier, more reliable, more powerful. Why? Because the membrane separating the realm of the living from the realm of the dead was at its thinnest point in the entire year. As darkness fell on Samhain, communities across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany performed a ritual that would have looked almost identical from village to village, valley to valley, a ritual that had been passed down for so many generations that no one remembered who began it. They extinguished every fire, every hearth, every torch, every flame in every home. The entire community plunged into absolute darkness. Try to imagine that for a moment. You're living in a world where fire is everything: warmth, light, cooking, safety, life itself. And on the darkest and most spiritually dangerous night of the year, you put it all out. Why? Because Samhain was about death and rebirth. The old year had to die completely, symbolically represented by the extinguishing of all flames, before the new year could be born. The Druids, meanwhile, were gathering at sacred sites, hilltops primarily, places where earth reached toward sky. In their white robes, they would build two massive bonfires, not from ordinary wood, but from specific sacred trees. Oak for strength, hawthorn for protection, rowan for magic. These weren't just fires, they were transformative portals. Historical records, including accounts written by Romans who witnessed Celtic practices, describe how the Druids would speak incantations over these flames. Long, complex chants in a language even more ancient than the Celtic tongue they normally spoke. Words that allegedly came from the oldest ancestors, from the time when God still walked among humans, when the moment was right, timed by the position of stars. By calculations we can only guess at, the Druids would light the Samhain fire, and the entire landscape would transform. We're not talking about a campfire, we're talking about infernos that could be seen for miles. Flames 20, 30 feet high, roaring against the night sky. The heat so intense you couldn't approach closer than 50 yards. The light so bright it cast shadows at midnight. Every community member would then approach, walking through the darkness carrying unlit torches, and relight their home fires from this sacred source. The symbolism was profound. The New Year's light came from a sacred fire blessed by Druids, kindled between two worlds, charged with spiritual power. But there was another purpose to these fires. The Druids did something else with those twin bonfires, something that reveals just how sophisticated their spiritual understanding truly was. They built the two fires close enough together that there was a narrow passage between them, perhaps 6 feet wide, and through this passage of flame, they drove the community's cattle. Now, our modern minds might think this was about practical purification, killing parasites, burning off disease. And yes, that was part of it. But the Celts understood it primarily as energetic cleansing. They believed that anything passing between sacred fires was stripped of negative spiritual attachments, that the flames didn't just burn the physical, they burned the invisible. They consumed bad luck, malevolent spirits, the accumulated spiritual grime of the dying year. And it wasn't just cattle. People walked between the flames too. Imagine it, the heat scorching your face, the roar of fire filling your ears, smoke stinging your eyes. Walking through a corridor of transformation, shedding the old year's burdens with every step. Emerging on the other side reborn, cleansed, ready for what comes next. This wasn't superstition, this was technology. Spiritual technology passed down through generations, refined through observation and practice, and it worked. We know it worked because it survived, because people continued doing it, year after year, century after century, in the face of Roman conquest and Christian conversion. But here's where Samhain becomes truly extraordinary. Here's why the church would later feel threatened enough to spend centuries trying to suppress it. The Celts believed and practiced as if it were absolute truth that on Samhain night, the dead could return, not as mindless zombies or terrifying revenants, but as conscious spirits, as ancestors, as the beloved departed returning for one night to visit the homes they once inhabited. This wasn't metaphor. Celts would set extra places at their Samhain feasts. They would leave doors unlatched. They would prepare the finest foods and set them out, knowing they wouldn't physically be eaten, but that the spirits would consume the essence of the offering. Think about what this means from a power structure perspective. In most ancient religions, if you wanted to communicate with the dead, you needed a priest. You needed someone with special access, special training, special authority. You needed an intermediary. But at Samhain, everyone could do it. The grandmother who died last winter could visit her family directly. The warrior who fell in battle could return to speak to his children. The ancient ancestors, going back generations, could return to offer wisdom, warnings, guidance, no priest required, no church necessary, just the natural power of this liminal night, available to everyone. Can you see why this was dangerous to institutional religion? But the Celts weren't naive. They understood that if beneficial spirits could cross on Samhain night, so could malevolent ones. The veil was thin in both directions. This is where we get the origins of Halloween imagery that survives to this day. The Celts developed specific protective practices, costumes, and masks. If harmful spirits were abroad, you didn't want to be recognized as human. Better to appear as something else, a fellow spirit, an animal, something not worth troubling. This is why Celts would wear animal skins and carved masks during Samhain. Not for fun, for camouflage. Carved turnips with lights inside. They would hollow out turnips, pumpkins came later from America, carve faces into them, and place candles inside. These served as lanterns for the spirits of deceased family members to find their way home. But they also served to frighten away malevolent entities. The grotesque faces suggested, a powerful spirit already guards this home. I'd say it. Food offerings left at crossroads. Crossroads, another threshold, another in-between space, were considered especially powerful on Samhain. Leaving food there appeased wandering spirits, giving them sustenance so they wouldn't trouble the living. These weren't quaint folk customs. They were survival strategies for navigating spiritual danger, and the Celts took them seriously. Now we need to talk about the Druids themselves, because they were the key to everything. The Druids were not simply Celtic priests. They were philosophers, astronomers, judges, healers, and keepers of oral history. In Celtic society, they held power that rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of kings. Here's what made them extraordinary. They never wrote anything down. This was intentional. Sacred knowledge was too important, too powerful, too dangerous to commit to writing. Writing could be stolen, copied, distributed to the unworthy, so the Druids maintained a purely oral tradition, memorizing vast amounts of information. Some sources suggest it took 20 years of training to become a full Druid. What did they know about Samhain that we've lost? We can only piece it together from fragments. Roman accounts mention that Druids could predict the future with startling accuracy on Samhain night. Celtic legends describe Druids opening doorways to the otherworld, the Celtic realm of spirits and gods, and returning with prophecies, with healing knowledge, with songs that could change reality. One practice we know about, Samhain divination. Young people, especially young women, would perform specific rituals on Samhain to divine their future. Who would they marry? How many children would they have? Would they survive the coming winter? The methods varied, reading patterns in nuts thrown into fire, interpreting dreams induced by eating specific foods before sleep, scrying in dark water under moonlight. But these weren't party games. The Celts believed that because the veil was thin, divination performed on Samhain had a direct line to actual future events. You weren't guessing, you were seeing. Modern archaeologists studying ancient Celtic sites have discovered something fascinating. Many of the locations where Samhain celebrations occurred are precisely astronomically aligned. Take the Hill of Tara in Ireland, the ancient seat of Celtic kings and a major Samhain gathering site. Recent studies have shown that the site's construction aligns with celestial events occurring in late October and early November. Or New Grange, the 5,000-year-old passage tomb that predates even the Celts. While it's famous for its winter solstice alignment, lesser-known chambers within the complex align with star positions specific to Samhain. What does this tell us? That the thinning veil wasn't arbitrary. The Celts were tracking real astronomical phenomena, planetary positions, star alignments, subtle gravitational effects that they associated with enhanced spiritual sensitivity. They didn't have our scientific language for it, but they were observing and documenting real, measurable cosmic events. Modern research into geomagnetic fields has shown that they do indeed fluctuate seasonally. That human consciousness appears to be more susceptible to certain types of experiences during periods of geomagnetic instability. That the boundary between autumn and winter does correlate with measurable environmental changes. Were the Celts measuring these things? We don't know, but they were certainly responding to them. To the Celts, Samhain wasn't just the new year. It was the dark half of the year beginning. Their calendar divided the year into two halves, the light half, Beltane to Samhain, roughly May to October, and the dark half, Samhain to Beltane, November to April. This wasn't about doom and gloom. Light and dark were equals, both necessary, both sacred. Summer was the time of action, of growth, of the external world. Winter was the time of reflection, of inner work, of the spirit world. Samhain marked the transition from doing to being, from harvest to storage, from expansion to contraction. And in that transition, in that liminal space between light and dark, the veil thinned. Now, step back and look at what we've described. Samhain was a time when every person could communicate directly with the dead. Divination was most accurate and accessible. The future could be glimpsed. Spiritual protection came from knowledge anyone could learn. Sacred fire was shared equally among all community members. The cosmos itself created conditions for heightened awareness. Notice anything? There's no centralized religious authority required. The Druids facilitated. They held knowledge. They timed the rituals. But the power of Samhain was available to everyone. The grandmother in her cottage could speak to her dead husband. The farmer could divine next year's harvest. The young woman could see her future. This was radically decentralized spirituality, and when Christianity arrived, this posed an enormous problem. Because the church's entire power structure depended on being the exclusive mediator between humans and the divine. You need a priest to give you communion. You need the church to grant you salvation. You need institutional approval to access the sacred. But someone said, no, you don't. The sacred is available directly to everyone. When the veil is thin, this couldn't be tolerated. Even now, in modern Ireland and Scotland, if you know where to look, you can find the marks of Samhain. Hilltops where the ancient fires burned still bear scorch marks visible to this day. The chemical composition of the soil has been permanently altered by centuries of ritual fires. Stone circles aligned to Samhain sunrises still stand. Wells where Samhain offerings were thrown still exist, their depths filled with centuries of accumulated gifts. And in rural areas, old people still remember, still practiced, still set an extra place at dinner on October 31st, just in case Grandma comes home. The church tried to erase Samhain. They tried to overwrite it, suppress it, demonize it, but the memory persisted in the land, in the people, in the unstoppable cycle of seasons that cares nothing for theology. Because Samhain wasn't invented by priests. It was observed in nature and honored through practice. And nature doesn't care what the Vatican says. So here's what we're left with. 2,000 years ago, on the exact date we now call Halloween, the Celtic people celebrated a festival based on observable natural phenomena. They developed sophisticated practices for navigating spiritual thresholds. They created a decentralized spiritual system accessible to everyone. Then the church arrived and spent centuries systematically suppressing, rewriting and obscuring these practices. The question is, what exactly were they afraid of? Was it simply the competition, another spiritual system threatening church authority, or was it something deeper? What if Samhain actually worked? What if the veil really does thin? What if the Celts had tapped into something real, something measurable, something that could be replicated? What if the church wasn't fighting superstition, but fighting knowledge? In the Vatican archives, there are documents we'll explore later that suggest the early church fathers took Celtic spirituality very seriously. Not as primitive folklore to be dismissed, but as genuine power to be contained. They didn't mock Samhain. They feared it. And that fear drove them to one of history's most ambitious campaigns of cultural suppression. But before we can understand what the church did to Halloween, we need to understand who did it. We need to talk about Rome, about power, about empire. We need to talk about what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable tradition, and that's where our story turns next. The Roman legions arrived in Celtic territories around 58 BC under Julius Caesar. They came with iron discipline, superior weapons, and an empire's confidence. What they found in the forests of Gaul, modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Britain both fascinated and disturbed them. The Romans were no strangers to foreign religions. Their empire had absorbed gods from Egypt, Persia, Greece, and dozens of smaller cultures. Roman religion was remarkably flexible. If you had a powerful god, Rome would make room for them in the pantheon. They saw divine power as additive, not exclusive. But the Celts were different. Roman historians like Julius Caesar, Tacitus, and Pliny the Elder left detailed accounts of Celtic religious practices. They wrote with a mixture of respect and revulsion. Respect because the Celts clearly possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex oral traditions, and a priest class, the Druids, whose authority rivaled their own augurs and priests. Revulsion because some Celtic practices struck Romans as barbaric. Human sacrifice was documented, though modern historians debate its frequency. The famous Wicker Man executions, where prisoners were allegedly burned alive inside giant human-shaped structures, may have been exaggerated by Roman propaganda. But what's undeniable is that Celtic spirituality treated death very differently than Roman religion did. To the Celts, death wasn't an ending. It was a transition. The otherworld, their realm of spirits and gods, was not some distant heaven. It was close, separated from the living world by the thinnest of membranes. And on certain nights, particularly Samhain, that membrane became permeable. The Romans found this concept deeply unsettling. Roman religion was transactional. You made offerings to gods. They provided favors. The boundaries were clear. Gods stayed in their realm, did humans in theirs. The dead went to the underworld and stayed there. But the Celts spoke of the dead returning, of gods walking among mortals, of a world where the sacred and profane weren't separated but intermingled, where your grandmother could visit on Samhain night, where prophecy came from thin spaces between worlds, where spiritual power didn't require temple priests. This bothered Rome not because it was strange, but because it worked outside Roman control. When Caesar conquered Gaul, he didn't just fight Celtic warriors. He fought a world view, and part of that war meant targeting the Druids specifically. Roman accounts describe the systematic destruction of sacred groves, the oak forests where Druids performed their rituals. These weren't military targets, they were spiritual infrastructure. Caesar understood something crucial: to truly conquer the Celts, you had to break their connection to the land, to the cycles, to the invisible world that gave their resistance meaning. Under Emperor Claudius in 54 AD, Rome took it further. They formally banned Druidism throughout the empire. Being a Druid became punishable by death. The rationale given was that Druids practiced human sacrifice, which Rome found abhorrent, never mind that Romans regularly executed criminals in public spectacles for entertainment. The real reason was power, and Druids held too much of it. They served as judges, settling disputes between tribes. They preserved history, maintaining the oral records that gave Celtic people their identity. They controlled the religious calendar, determining when festivals like Samhain would be celebrated. Most dangerously, they taught that knowledge of the divine was accessible to everyone through direct experience, not mediated by state-sanctioned authorities. Rome couldn't allow that. So the Druids were hunted, their sacred sites destroyed, their oak groves cut down and burned, particularly painful because oaks were central to Druidic practice, considered the most sacred trees as. The systematic destruction of ancient oak forests across what's now France and Britain wasn't just environmental, it was spiritual warfare. But here's what Rome discovered. You can kill priests, but you can't kill practices embedded in the land itself. Even after the Druids were gone, Celtic people continued celebrating Samhain. They continued lighting bonfires on October 31st. They continued setting places for the dead. They continued believing that the veil thinned and spirits walked. Why? Because Samhain wasn't invented by Druids. It was observed in nature and honored through practice. The shortening days, the dying vegetation, the quality of late October air, these weren't created by priests. They just were, and people responded to them instinctively. Rome could ban the teachers, but they couldn't ban autumn. This created a problem that would persist for centuries. Roman authority had conquered Celtic lands politically and militarily. But spiritually, the old ways persisted. Underground? Yes. Less organized? Certainly. But alive. Then something happened that changed everything. In 313 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity. By the late 4th century, Christianity had become the Roman state religion. Suddenly, the Roman Empire, the same empire that had been persecuting Christians for centuries, became Christian itself. And with imperial backing, Christianity began spreading rapidly across Roman territories, including Celtic lands. Now the Celts faced a new kind of conqueror, not Roman legions with swords, but Christian missionaries with scriptures. The early Christian approach to Celtic spirituality was complex. Some missionaries, particularly those from Ireland and Scotland, took a syncretic approach. They tried to blend Christian teaching with existing Celtic practices. They found parallels: the Christian Trinity and the Celtic triple goddess, Christian saints and Celtic hero gods, Christian holy days and Celtic seasonal festivals. This created what scholars call Celtic Christianity, a unique fusion that preserved some Celtic elements while wrapping them in Christian theology. Irish monks, for instance, continued illuminating manuscripts with Celtic knotwork and spirals, patterns that predated Christianity by centuries. But as Christianity became more organized, more centralized, more Roman in structure, this tolerance diminished. By the 5th and 6th centuries, church authorities, increasingly based in Rome, began viewing Celtic practices as competition, not complement. The decentralized nature of Celtic spirituality conflicted with the church's hierarchical structure. The Celtic emphasis on direct spiritual experience threatened the church's role as necessary mediator between humans and God. Most problematic of all, Samhain. Christian missionaries arriving in Celtic territories in the 6th and 7th centuries encountered communities deeply committed to this festival. The bonfires still burned. The dead were still honored. The veil was still believed to thin. The church faced a choice: try to crush someone completely or transform it. History shows they chose transformation. But understanding why requires understanding the specific threat Samhain posed to Christian theology. Christianity taught that the dead went to one of three places: heaven, hell, or purgatory. They stayed there, awaiting final judgment. Communication with the dead was forbidden. It was necromancy, explicitly condemned in Scripture. But Samhain said the dead could return, that they walked among the living one night a year, that you could set a place for grandma and she'd visit, that the boundary between life and death was permeable, not absolute. This wasn't just a different belief, it was a competing cosmology. And it undermined fundamental Christian teachings about death, judgment, and the afterlife. Moreover, Samhain suggested that spiritual power, the ability to communicate across the veil, was available to everyone on this night. You didn't need a priest to facilitate contact with the dead. You didn't need church blessing. You just needed to wait for October 31st and the veil would thin naturally. This decentralization of spiritual authority was intolerable to an increasingly centralized church. So the strategy emerged: keep the date, keep the general structure, but completely change the meaning. In 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV established the Feast of All Martyrs, initially celebrated in May. Then in 731 AD, Pope Gregory III expanded it to honor all saints and, crucially, moved it to November 1st. This wasn't coincidental. November 1st was the first day of the Celtic New Year, the day after Samhain. By placing a major Christian feast on this date, the Church was attempting to overlay Christian meaning onto Celtic timing. The vigil before All Saints' Day, October 31st, became All Hallows' Eve, later shortened to Halloween. But the Church did something cleverer than just renaming. They reframed the entire cosmology, where Samhain celebrated the thinning veil and welcomed ancestral spirits. All Hallows' Eve warned that evil spirits were abroad on this night. The dead who returned weren't beloved ancestors, they were dangerous souls, possibly damned, possibly demonic. Where Samhain encouraged communication with the dead, the Church taught that any spirits encountered on All Hallows' Eve should be warded off, not welcomed. Where Samhain used fire for purification and transformation, Christian teaching associated Halloween fires with protection against evil. The practices looked similar. Bonfires still burned, people still dressed in disguise, food was still offered. But the Church had inverted the meaning. What was once sacred communion became spiritual warfare. What was once ancestral connection became demonic threat. This reframing served multiple purposes. It allowed Celtic people to continue familiar practices. The Church learned from Rome's earlier mistake that you can't simply ban what's embedded in the land. but it redirected those practices away from the decentralized, direct spiritual access that Samhain represented. Now you needed the church. You needed priests to bless you against the evil spirits. You needed holy water, prayers, church-sanctioned protection. The power that had been freely available on Samhain night was now controlled, mediated, owned by the church. The transformation wasn't instant. For centuries, even as Christianity spread, rural communities in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany continued practicing Samhain much as their ancestors had. The bonfires honored the turning year. The veil was still believed to thin. Ancestors were still welcomed. But gradually, generation by generation, the church's version took hold. Samhain became Halloween. The sophisticated Celtic cosmology, with its understanding of liminal time, its respect for death as transition, its belief in permeable boundaries between worlds, was reduced to superstition about evil spirits. What the Romans couldn't destroy with swords, what official bans couldn't suppress, the church conquered through patient transformation. Yet even in victory, the church couldn't completely erase Samhain. Too much survived: the date itself, the bonfires, the costumes, the acknowledgement that something about this night is different, liminal, charged. Every modern Halloween tradition carries Celtic DNA. Every jack-o'-lantern echoes turnip lights that once guided ancestral spirits home. Every costume recalls the sacred practice of moving between worlds in disguise. Every trick-or-treat offering remembers food left for the dead. The church renamed it, reframed it, claimed it, but they couldn't kill it. And that's what brings us to the deeper mystery. Because if Samhain was simply primitive superstition, why did the church spend centuries carefully transforming rather than simply dismissing it? Why the elaborate overlay of Christian meaning? Why the warnings about evil spirits instead of just declaring it foolishness? The church's actions suggest they took Samhain seriously, not as harmless folklore, but as genuine spiritual practice with real effects. What did they know that they've never publicly acknowledged? What texts exist in Vatican archives documenting early encounters between Christian missionaries and Celtic spiritual practices? What instructions were given to priests dealing with populations still celebrating Samhain? These questions lead us to the next chapter of our story. Because the transformation of Samhain into Halloween was just the beginning. What came next was centuries of active suppression, of burning what couldn't be transformed, of locking away what couldn't be burned. Pope Gregory III stood in his chamber in the year 731 AD, studying a problem that had vexed church authorities for generations. Across the former Roman Empire, now Christianized, Celtic populations continued their ancient practices. Every autumn, bonfires burned on hilltops. Every October 31st, communities honored the dead and celebrated the turning year. The church had tried suppression. It hadn't worked. The practices were too deeply embedded in the rhythm of agricultural life, too connected to observable natural cycles. You could execute druids, but you couldn't execute autumn. Gregory understood what his predecessors had not. You don't destroy what you cannot defeat. You transform it. On November 1st, 731 AD, Pope Gregory III established the Feast of All Saints, a day to honor all Christian martyrs and saints. The date was not arbitrary. It was precisely calculated to fall on the first day of the Celtic New Year, the day immediately following Samhain. This wasn't the first attempt at such overlay. In 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV had created a similar feast, initially celebrated in May, but May carried no power for Celtic populations. The real spiritual energy, the real communal momentum, occurred in late October and early November. Gregory III understood this, so he moved the feast. Same holiday, different date, a date that would compete directly with Samhain for the attention and devotion of newly Christianized Celtic peoples. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Keep the structure, change the meaning. Celtic communities were accustomed to gathering on November 1st. They expected religious observance. They anticipated communal ritual. Gregory gave them exactly that, just reframed within Christian theology. Instead of honoring the ancestors who crossed the veil on Samhain, they would honor Christian saints who already resided in heaven. Instead of welcoming spirits of the dead, they would venerate the holy dead officially recognized by Rome. Instead of decentralized communion with whatever spirits appeared, they would have centralized worship of church-approved figures. The genius lay in what remained unchanged: the date, the sense of sacred time, the communal gathering, the acknowledgement that this day was different from ordinary days. People could continue their familiar patterns while slowly, almost imperceptibly, those patterns were being redirected. But Gregory went further. Understanding that people also observed October 31st as the vigil before the new year. He designated this evening as All Hallows' Eve, the vigil before the feast of All Hallows, Saints. Eventually, this became Halloween. Again, the structure remained, the vigil existed, the sense of threshold time persisted. But now it was Christian. Now it required church context to understand. Now it pointed toward church-controlled meaning. The true brilliance emerged in how the church handled the specific practices of Samhain. They couldn't simply ban bonfires. People needed them for practical warmth and light during harvest season. They couldn't forbid gatherings. Community bonds were essential for survival. They couldn't eliminate all reference to the dead. Death was a universal human experience. So they recontextualized everything. Bonfires remained, but now they were lit to ward off evil spirits rather than to purify and transform. The shift was subtle but profound. Samhain fires had been about positive transformation, burning away the old year to make space for the new, purifying livestock and people through cleansing flames. All Hallows' Eve fires became defensive, protection against malevolent forces. This reframing served church interests perfectly. If fires were about defense against evil, then spiritual danger lurked on this night. If danger lurked, people needed protection. And who provided protection? The church? Through prayers, through holy water, through the blessing of priests. What had been empowering became frightening. What had been accessible became mediated. The church also transformed how the dead were conceptualized on this night. In Celtic tradition, Samhain allowed beneficial ancestor spirits to return for communion with the living. Families welcomed them, set places for them, honored them with food and warmth. Church teaching maintained that the dead could not simply return at will. Souls resided in heaven, hell, or purgatory, awaiting final judgment. To suggest otherwise contradicted fundamental Christian eschatology. But the church couldn't simply deny what people experienced. Too many reported feeling the presence of deceased loved ones on this night. Too many traditions reinforced the idea that October 31st was special for the dead, so the church reinterpreted it. Yes, spirits might be abroad on All Hallows' Eve, but not beneficial ancestors, dangerous entities, lost souls, possibly demons masquerading as beloved dead. This inversion was psychologically powerful. It took the comforting Celtic practice of ancestor veneration and made it terrifying. It took what had been sacred communion and made it spiritual warfare. Suddenly, people needed the church more than ever. You couldn't simply welcome whatever appeared at your door on Halloween night. It might be demonic. You needed discernment. You needed protection. You needed prayers and blessings that only priests could provide. The church also transformed divination practices. Celts had used Samhain for prophecy and future seeing, believing the thin veil allowed glimpses across time as well as between worlds. Young people particularly engaged in divination to learn about future spouses, children, fortune. The church condemned divination as witchcraft while simultaneously absorbing modified versions of it. Saints' feast days became occasions for approved forms of fortune-telling. Specific prayers could reveal God's will about the future, but it all had to flow through church channels, using church-approved methods. What had been direct access became mediated access. What had been natural became supernatural, in the specific sense of requiring supernatural church authority to navigate safely. Perhaps most cleverly, the church maintained many Samhain symbols while emptying them of original meaning. The practice of wearing costumes continued, but the reasoning changed. Celts wore masks to move undetected among spirits or to honor animal totems. Church teaching suggested costumes frightened away evil spirits or allowed participation in mystery plays about saints. Food offerings to the dead continued, but recontextualized as souling, a practice where poor people went door to door receiving soul cakes in exchange for praying for the donor's deceased relatives. This transformed direct offering to ancestors into a transaction mediated by Christian prayer and church-approved intercession. Same practice, completely different cosmology underneath. The Church also added new elements that had no Celtic precedent but served Christian purposes. In 998 AD, the abbot of Cluny established November 2nd as All Souls' Day, a day specifically for praying for the dead in purgatory. This created a 3-day sequence: October 31st, All Hallows' Eve; November 1st, All Saints' Day; November 2nd, All Souls' Day. Together, these perfectly overlaid the Celtic 3-day Samhain festival while completely reframing its meaning within Christian theology. The brilliance was that it felt traditional to Celtic converts. 3 days of observance around the year's turning? That matched their ancient pattern. But all the content had been replaced. The cosmology had been swapped out. The power structure had been inverted. And it happened gradually enough that many people didn't notice the transformation occurring. This strategy of transformation, rather than elimination, extended to physical spaces as well. Rather than destroying Celtic sacred sites, the Church built churches on top of them. Holy wells became baptismal fonts. Sacred groves that couldn't be destroyed became sites of Christian shrines. Hilltop firesites became locations for Christian chapels. This served multiple purposes. It allowed people to continue worshiping in familiar locations, easing the transition to Christianity. It Christianized the landscape itself. And it literally built church authority on top of older power structures. But archaeological evidence shows this pattern throughout former Celtic territories. In Ireland, many ancient churches sit on sites that show evidence of pre-Christian ritual use. In Scotland, Christian standing stones often incorporate older Celtic symbols. In Wales, churches frequently occupy locations that were sacred to earlier inhabitants. The Church wasn't destroying Celtic spirituality. It was absorbing it, transforming it, claiming it. But this transformation strategy created a problem that would haunt the Church for centuries. The old meanings didn't completely disappear. They went underground. They survived in folk practices that continued alongside official Church teachings. Rural communities in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales maintained dual traditions. They attended All Saints' Day Mass, and they still left food for ancestors on Samhain night. They received church blessings, and they still lit bonfires the old way. They prayed to Christian saints, and they still whispered to older spirits when alone. The Church called this superstition and spent centuries trying to eliminate these remnants. But they persisted because they were rooted in something the Church couldn't control: the actual experience of living in rhythm with the land. Farmers knew October 31st felt different. They observed it in animal behavior, in the quality of twilight, in their own dreams and intuitions. They didn't need druids to tell them the veil was thin. They felt it. And no amount of church reframing could eliminate what people directly experienced. This tension between official church teaching and lived experience created space for what historians call popular religion, the Christianity actually practiced by common people, which often retained elements the institutional church had tried to suppress. Halloween became a perfect example. Officially, it was All Hallows' Eve, a Christian vigil before a saint's feast day. Unofficially, it retained strong Celtic elements, the sense of the dead being near, the practice of divination, the feeling that ordinary rules didn't apply on this night. The Church tried to control this through regular denunciations. Medieval church councils repeatedly condemned Halloween excesses, people drinking too much, engaging in divination, telling stories about fairies and spirits, maintaining practices that seemed more pagan than Christian. But the condemnations continued century after century, which tells us the practices continued too. If the Church had successfully transformed Halloween into a purely Christian observance, there would have been no need for repeated warnings against pagan elements. The fact that such warnings persisted into the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries reveals that Samhain never truly died. It just wore Christian clothing. This created a peculiar situation where Halloween became simultaneously very Christian and very pagan. In different regions, different elements dominated. In some areas, All Hallows' Eve was primarily a solemn religious observance focused on prayer for the dead. In others, it retained wild, carnivalesque elements that had more in common with Samhain than with church-sanctioned piety. The Church's inability to fully control Halloween's meaning would eventually become apparent in how the holiday evolved, particularly after it crossed the Atlantic to America, where it would undergo yet another transformation. But before we get there, we need to understand what the Church did with the knowledge it couldn't transform, because not everything about Samhain could be reframed. Some things were too explicitly non-Christian, too clearly derived from Celtic cosmology that contradicted Church teaching. What happened to that knowledge? The answer involves documents that most people have never heard of. Church records from the conversion period that detail exactly what missionaries encountered and exactly how they were instructed to handle it. Letters between bishops discussing the problem of Samhain, reports from priests in Celtic territories describing practices they couldn't explain within Christian theology. Much of this material was classified, restricted, or eventually locked away, because it contained admissions that church authorities couldn't publicly make, that Celtic spiritual practices sometimes produced real effects that Christianity couldn't explain, that divination on Samhain night sometimes yielded accurate predictions, that people who honored the old ways reported genuine experiences of contact with the deceased, that the veil really did seem to thin, even to Christian observers. These documents would be dangerous if widely known. They would reveal that the Church's transformation of Halloween wasn't motivated by theological purity, but by competition with a spiritual system that actually worked. In the Vatican archives today, there are sections classified as sensitive historical materials that researchers cannot access without special permission rarely granted. Among these are documents related to the conversion of Celtic territories and the establishment of Christian holidays to replace pagan festivals. What's in those documents? We can only guess. But the fact that they remain restricted 1,000 years later suggests the Church still fears what they contain. What if they document early Church authorities admitting that Samhain practices produced real spiritual results? What if they contain strategies for suppressing knowledge that couldn't be reframed? What if they prove that Church fathers knew they were overlaying Samhain with Christian holidays, not because the Celtic version was false, but because it was true and accessible to everyone without church mediation? The transformation of Samhain into Halloween represents one of history's most successful campaigns of cultural appropriation and spiritual colonization. The Church took an indigenous spiritual practice, maintained its external structure while gutting its internal meaning, and claimed the result as Christian. And they did it so effectively that most people celebrating Halloween today have no idea they're participating in the faded remnants of a powerful Celtic spiritual technology. But the transformation was never complete. It couldn't be yet. Because at Halloween's core lies something the Church could rename but never truly control. The actual thinning of the veil that occurs each year as autumn dies into winter. That thinning doesn't care what you call it. It doesn't require Christian or Celtic cosmology to occur. It just is. And every year, on October 31st, people feel it. Even if they can't name what they're feeling, even if they've never heard of Samhain, the veil thins, the dead draw near, the year prepares to turn. No amount of church reframing changes that fundamental reality, which brings us to the symbols themselves, the images and practices that survive the Church's transformation and remain embedded in Halloween to this day. Because if you know what to look for, you can still see Samhain hiding in plain sight. Walk through any American neighborhood on October 31st and you'll see them everywhere. Orange pumpkins with glowing faces, children in ghost costumes, bowls of candy waiting by doorsteps, skeletons hanging from trees, bats and witches and black cats. Most people think these are just fun decorations, harmless symbols of a commercial holiday, but every single one carries Celtic DNA. Every jack-o'-lantern, every costume, Every tradition practiced on Halloween night echoes something the church tried to erase but couldn't quite destroy. The symbols survived because they were too powerful to kill, too embedded in human instinct, too connected to something real that happens every year when autumn dies into winter. Let's start with the most iconic Halloween symbol of all, the jack-o'-lantern. In modern America, we carve pumpkins. We scoop out the insides, cut triangular eyes and toothy grins, and place candles inside to create that distinctive glow. It's become so normalized that most people never question why we do it. It's just what you do on Halloween. But pumpkins are native to the Americas. The Celts never saw one until after European colonization. So what were they carving 2,000 years ago on Samhain night? Turnips, and sometimes beets or potatoes. Irish and Scottish families would hollow out these root vegetables, carve faces into them, and place burning embers inside. The result was far more unsettling than modern pumpkin decorations. These weren't cute, cartoonish faces. They were grotesque, disturbing, meant to frighten. Why? Because they served a specific spiritual function. Celtic tradition held that wandering spirits were abroad on Samhain night, not all of them friendly, not all of them ancestors. Some were malevolent entities drawn to the thin veil, looking for vulnerable humans to torment or possess. The carved faces served as spiritual guardians. They mimicked the appearance of powerful protective spirits, grotesque enough to ward off malevolent forces, luminous enough to guide beneficial ones. The light inside represented the sacred fire of Samhain, the transformative flame that burned between worlds. When Irish immigrants came to America in the 19th century, they brought this tradition with them. They discovered pumpkins, larger, easier to carve, more abundant than turnips, and adapted. The practice remained. The meaning faded. By the early 20th century, most Americans carving pumpkins had no idea they were practicing a Celtic protective ritual against wandering spirits. The church's reframing had worked. What was once sacred technology became secular decoration, but the instinct remained. People still carved faces, still placed light inside, still felt that these glowing guardians were somehow appropriate for this particular night. The name jack-o'-lantern itself carries hidden meaning. It comes from an Irish folktale about Stingy Jack, a trickster who trapped the devil and made him promise never to claim Jack's soul. When Jack died, heaven wouldn't take him because of his sinful life, and hell couldn't take him because of his deal with the devil. So Jack was condemned to wander the earth forever, carrying only a hollowed turnip with a burning coal inside to light his way through the darkness. This story is itself a Christian overlay on older Celtic beliefs about souls caught between worlds. Jack represents what the Celts always knew, that some spirits don't cleanly transition from life to death. They linger, they wander, they exist in the liminal spaces, and on Samhain night, when the veil is thinnest, those wandering souls draw near. The jack-o'-lantern acknowledges this reality while providing protection against it. Even now, when most people think they're just making Halloween decorations, they're unconsciously performing a ritual that predates Christianity by centuries. Next, consider costumes. In modern America, Halloween costumes are about fantasy and fun. Children dress as superheroes, princesses, movie characters. Adults wear elaborate outfits to parties. The emphasis is on creativity, humor, sometimes sexiness. But why do we wear costumes on this specific night? The answer lies buried in Celtic practice. On Samhain, the veil between worlds thinned in both directions. Not only could spirits cross into our realm, humans could potentially cross into theirs, or at least become visible to entities that normally couldn't perceive us. This created danger. Celtic cosmology included not just benevolent ancestors, but also the Ausi, powerful fairy beings who were dangerous to encounter directly. These weren't Tinkerbell-style pixies. They were formidable entities capable of abducting humans, stealing souls, or causing madness. On Samhain night, when the boundaries weakened, the Ausi were particularly active, and they were drawn to humans. Celtic solution? Disguise. If you dressed as something other than human, as an animal, as a grotesque creature, as one of the spirits themselves, you might pass unnoticed. The Ausi wouldn't recognize you as human prey. You could move through the dangerous night hidden in plain sight. Adults wore animal skins and carved wooden masks. They covered themselves in ash to appear ghostly. They dressed in tattered clothing to seem like spirits of the dead. The more convincing the disguise, the safer you were. Children particularly needed protection. Celtic families would dress their young in the most frightening costumes they could create, making them appear as dangerous spirits themselves. Better to seem threatening than vulnerable when real supernatural forces were abroad. This practice continued for centuries, even as Christianity spread. The Church tried to reframe it, suggesting that costumes represented saints or angels, that dressing up was about honoring holy figures. But the folk practice persisted in its original form, especially in rural areas. People still dressed as frightening things, still covered their faces, still attempted to become something other than obviously human on Halloween night. When the tradition crossed to America, commercialization emptied it of spiritual meaning. Costumes became entertainment, but the timing remained. The practice endured. On October 31st specifically, people still feel compelled to transform their appearance. The instinct survives even when the reason is forgotten. Then there's trick-or-treating, perhaps the most beloved American Halloween tradition. Children going door to door, receiving candy, chanting trick-or-treat. Seems innocent enough. Just kids collecting sweets. But the practice descends from something far more serious: Celtic offerings to appease the dead. On Samhain night, Celtic families would leave food and drink outside their homes. These weren't charitable gifts, they were spiritual protection payments. The offerings served multiple purposes. First, they fed wandering ancestral spirits who might return home on this night. Providing sustenance showed respect and welcome. Families believed their ancestors would bless them in return. Second, they appeased potentially dangerous spirits. If malevolent entities found food waiting, they might take it and move on rather than troubling the household. Third, they demonstrated participation in the sacred order of Samhain. By making offerings, you showed you understood and respected the thinning veil. This brought you into harmony with cosmic forces rather than opposition to them. As Christianity spread, this practice transformed into souling. On All Souls' Day, November 2nd, poor people would go door to door offering to pray for the dead relatives of those who gave them food. This Christianized the exchange. Instead of directly feeding spirits, you fed people who would pray for spirits. Eventually, this became children going door to door in costume, performing songs or tricks in exchange for treats. The spiritual transaction faded. The practice remained. But notice what survives: the date, the door-to-door movement, the exchange of food, the implicit threat in trick-or-treat, give us something or face consequences. These are all Celtic elements, stripped of original meaning but structurally intact. Modern children collecting candy are unknowingly performing a ritual that once served to maintain right relationship with the spirit world during its most dangerous night. Even the types of treats carry hidden symbolism. Why do we give candy specifically? The answer connects to Celtic soul cakes, sweetbreads made with spices, marked with crosses, given as offerings to the dead. These soul cakes represented the sweetness of life, the sustenance of the living shared with the dead. Modern candy serves the same function, though we've forgotten why. Consider also the timing of trick-or-treating. It happens at dusk, as darkness falls, not during broad daylight, not deep into night. At the threshold between day and night, this matches Celtic practice perfectly. Samhain rituals occurred at liminal times: sunset, midnight, dawn. The threshold between light and dark mirrored the threshold between worlds. The most powerful moments happened when one thing was dying and another being born. Modern trick-or-treating preserves this without anyone consciously planning it. Children instinctively go out as darkness approaches. The practice naturally gravitates toward threshold time. Let's talk about the colors of Halloween: orange and black. Most people assume these are arbitrary. Orange for pumpkins, black for night, but the symbolism runs deeper. Orange represents the harvest, the dying light of autumn. Fire, transformation. It's the color of leaves turning, of crops gathered, of the sun weakening as winter approaches. Orange is the color of change, of the old order yielding to the new. Black represents death, the unknown, the void between worlds, the fertile darkness where seeds germinate before sprouting into light. Black is potential, mystery, the womb of transformation. Together, orange and black represent the core of Samhain theology, death and rebirth, ending and beginning, the fire of transformation burning through the darkness of change. The Celts would have used these colors symbolically even if they didn't think of them as Halloween colors per se. Their sacred fires, orange, burned against the darkness of late autumn nights, Blacolade. The symbolism was embedded in the natural world they observed. Modern Halloween has preserved this color scheme so completely that orange and black immediately evoke the holiday. Walk into any store in October and these colors dominate, not because of conscious Celtic revival, but because something in us recognizes that these colors belong to this time, to this night, to this threshold. Even specific Halloween creatures carry Celtic meaning. Bats? The Celts noticed that bats became more visible around Samhain fires. Drawn to the insects attracted to flame, bats would swoop and dive around bonfires, creating an eerie display. They seemed to exist between categories, not birds, but winged, not beasts, but airborne, liminal creatures for a liminal night. Black cats. Celtic tradition held that the AOC could take animal form, particularly cats. A black cat on Samhain night might be exactly what it appeared, or it might be something far more powerful wearing fur as disguise. Better to respect all cats on this night, just in case. Owls, birds of the night, associated with wisdom and death. The Celts believed owls could see between worlds, their night vision symbolizing the ability to perceive what humans normally couldn't. On Samhain, when those boundaries dissolved and owls became messengers and omens, spiders and their webs, symbols of fate, of the delicate threads connecting all things. Celtic tradition associated spiders with the weaving of destiny. On Samhain night, when past and future became visible, spiders represented the interconnected web of time itself. The Church tried to demonize all these creatures, associating them with witchcraft and devil worship. But the folk tradition never fully accepted this. People continued recognizing these animals as special, liminal, worthy of attention on Halloween night. The modern haunted house, now a Halloween staple, descends from Celtic beliefs about certain locations being permanently thin. The Celts recognized that some places naturally held more spiritual energy than others. Crossroads, ancient battlefields, burial grounds, certain wells and springs, these were dangerous spots where the veil remained perpetually fragile. On Samhain, when the already thin veil became nearly transparent, these locations became extremely hazardous. Only the foolish or the very brave approached them. This evolved into stories about haunted places, locations where the dead lingered, where supernatural forces concentrated. The modern haunted house for entertainment purposes mimics this, creating a space where normal rules don't apply, where frightening things emerge, where you voluntarily enter danger. We think we're playing, but we're actually honoring an ancient recognition that certain spaces hold different energy, that boundaries can be breached, that sometimes the door between worlds stands open. Even the act of telling scary stories on Halloween night has Celtic roots. Samhain was traditionally a time for recounting tales of ancestors, of heroes who had crossed into the other world, of encounters with supernatural beings. These weren't just entertainment, they were oral history, spiritual education, communal processing of mysteries that defied ordinary understanding. By speaking about the dead and the spirits, you acknowledged their reality. You kept memory alive. Modern Halloween ghost stories serve the same function, though we've lost awareness of it. When children gather to tell frightening tales on October 31st, they're participating in an ancient practice of using story to navigate fear, to honor mystery, to speak about death when death feels near. Perhaps most remarkably, the general feeling of Halloween has survived intact. Walk outside on October 31st evening and pay attention. There's something in the air. Not just cultural conditioning, something atmospheric, energetic, liminal. The light has a particular quality as autumn dies. The temperature carries a specific chill. The wind sounds different. The darkness feels alive in a way it doesn't other nights. This is what the Celts were responding to. This is the real thin veil, manifesting through observable natural phenomena that occur regardless of belief systems. The Church could rename the holiday, reframe the practices, demonize the symbols. But they couldn't change the actual thinning that occurs each year as summer dies into winter. And because that thinning is real, measurable in geomagnetic shifts, observable in animal behavior, felt in human consciousness, the practices connected to it survived. Not perfectly, not with full understanding, but they survived. Every jack-o'-lantern glowing on a porch is a Celtic protection ritual. Every child in costume is wearing spiritual camouflage. Every bowl of candy represents an offering to the dead. Every haunted house acknowledges that some spaces exist between worlds. The symbols survived because they're not arbitrary. They're responses to actual phenomena that occur when autumn transitions to winter, when the year dies and prepares to be reborn, when the membrane between visible and invisible naturally thins. The Church could overlay Christian meaning, but they couldn't eliminate what those symbols pointed to, a reality that exists independent of any theology. And so Halloween became a strange hybrid, officially Christian, honoring All Hallows, unofficially Celtic, acknowledging the thin veil, commercially American, serving capitalism through candy sales and costume purchases, but underneath all those layers, Samhain persists, waiting, patient as the turning seasons. Every year, on October 31st, people unknowingly participate in rituals designed 2,000 years ago by Druids who understood something about the nature of time, death, and the boundaries between worlds. The knowledge was suppressed, the cosmology was reframed. The theology was replaced, but the practices endured because they work with something real, and that reality, that annual thinning, that genuine threshold between worlds, doesn't care what the Vatican says about it. The Druids left no written records. This wasn't because they couldn't write. Archaeological evidence shows that Celtic societies had writing systems, Ogham script, borrowed Greek and Latin alphabets. They could record information when they chose to. But the Druids deliberately chose not to, and that choice tells us everything about what they understood regarding knowledge, power, and transmission. Julius Caesar, who spent years fighting Celtic tribes in Gaul, documented this in his commentaries. He noted with puzzlement that the Druids forbade writing down their sacred knowledge. Students spent up to 20 years memorizing vast amounts of information, cosmology, law, history, medicine, prophecy, but nothing was committed to text. Why this prohibition? Because the Druids understood something that the Church would later exploit. Whoever controls the written record controls the narrative. Written texts can be seized, copied, altered, distributed to the unworthy. Oral tradition maintains purity of transmission and restricts access to those deemed ready. But it also means that when the Romans systematically killed Druids and when Christianity converted their students, the knowledge died with them. Almost everything the Druids knew vanished. Almost. Fragments survived, in Irish and Welsh mythology preserved by Christian monks, in folk practices that continued despite church condemnation, in archaeological evidence, stone circles, burial mounds, astronomical alignments that reveals what they observed even if not why. And what those fragments reveal is extraordinary. The Druids possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge that rivaled and in some cases exceeded that of Mediterranean civilizations. Sites like Stonehenge and Newgrange demonstrate this conclusively. These aren't crude rock piles, they're precision instruments for tracking celestial movements. Newgrange, built around 3200 BC, predating both the Druids and the pyramids, features a passage aligned so perfectly with the winter solstice sunrise that on that single morning each year, light penetrates the chamber and illuminates the innermost recess. The mathematical precision required to achieve this is remarkable. The Druids didn't build Newgrange, but they inherited it and understood it. They used such sites as part of their astronomical practice because they knew something essential. The cosmos follows patterns. Those patterns are observable, and observing them grants power. The Celtic calendar system demonstrates this knowledge. They didn't use the Roman solar calendar or the Jewish lunar calendar. They employed a lunisolar system that synchronized moon phases with solar years through complex intercalation, adding extra months when needed to keep seasons aligned. We know this from the Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet discovered in France in 1897, dating to around 200 AD. This calendar is one of the only surviving written records of Celtic timekeeping, demonstrating their sophisticated astronomical knowledge. It's inscribed with Gaulish text describing a 5-year calendar cycle of 62 months. The mathematical sophistication is remarkable. It accounts for the actual 29.5-day lunar cycle and the 365.25-day solar year with precision comparable to modern calculations. This wasn't superstition. This was science, and the calendar divided the year in ways that revealed deep understanding of natural energy cycles. 4 major festivals, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, fell at the cross-quarter points between solstices and equinoxes, not on the equinoxes themselves, but halfway between. Why? Because the Druids observed that the most intense seasonal energies manifested not at the astronomical extremes, but at the transition points. The deepest winter cold doesn't occur at winter solstice, but weeks after, said. The most potent spring growth doesn't happen at spring equinox, but weeks later. By placing festivals at cross-quarter points, the Druids synchronized ritual with actual observable energy shifts in nature. Samhain on October 31st marked the true beginning of winter energy, not the astronomical winter solstice on December 21st. This shows they were empiricists, not mystics following arbitrary traditions. They observed nature carefully and built their spiritual practice around what they actually witnessed. The thin veil concept demonstrates this empirical approach. Modern science has confirmed what Celts observed. Geomagnetic field variations occur seasonally. Human consciousness appears more susceptible to certain types of experiences during periods of geomagnetic flux. The boundary between waking and sleeping, between normal consciousness and altered states, does seem more permeable at specific times. Late October shows measurable changes in atmospheric electromagnetic fields. Animals behave differently. Human sleep patterns shift. The quality of twilight changes as the angle of sunlight approaches winter solstice extremes. The Druids didn't have instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, but they had something equally valuable: generations of careful observation. They noticed that people reported more vivid dreams in late October, that divination seemed more accurate, that the dead seemed nearer. Rather than dismissing these experiences as imagination, they took them seriously. They developed practices to work with what they observed, and those practices produced consistent results across generations. This is why the Church eventually found Celtic spirituality threatening. It wasn't random superstition. It was a competing knowledge system based on direct observation of nature, accessible to anyone willing to observe carefully. The Druids also understood plant medicine in ways that modern science is only beginning to recover. They knew which herbs induced specific consciousness states, which plants healed particular ailments, which fungi opened doorways to visionary experience. This knowledge was practical and precise. Oak bark for tanning and medicine, mistletoe cut with golden sickles at specific moon phases for maximum potency. Specific mushrooms consumed during Samhain rituals to facilitate communication with spirits. The Catholic Church later condemned all of this as witchcraft, but it was pharmacology. The Druids simply lacked modern terminology for describing alkaloids, active compounds, and neurochemical pathways. They knew empirically what worked. Medieval herbalism, which the Church eventually absorbed and sanctified, descended directly from Druidic practice. The wise women burned as witches were often holders of this botanical knowledge, passed down through generations from the time when Druids openly practiced. The Church couldn't completely suppress this knowledge because people needed it. They got sick. Plants healed them, so the Church reframed herbal medicine as acceptable while condemning the consciousness-altering aspects as demonic. But the Druids made no such distinction. To them, healing the body and expanding consciousness were complementary. Both involved working with natural substances in harmony with cosmic timing. A medicine harvested at the wrong moon phase was less effective. A vision induced at the wrong seasonal moment yielded unclear results. This holistic understanding, that physical, mental, and spiritual were interwoven, directly contradicted the Church's dualistic theology separating body and soul, physical and spiritual, natural and supernatural. The Druids also possessed knowledge about consciousness itself that remains provocative. They believed human awareness could be trained to perceive beyond ordinary sensory limits. That with proper practice, one could see the dead, communicate across distances, glimpse future events. Modern parapsychology has documented phenomena that sound remarkably similar: remote viewing, precognition, mediumship. Whether these phenomena are real or not remains debated, but the Druids certainly believed they were real and developed systematic training for cultivating such abilities. Druidic education lasted 20 years for a reason. It wasn't just memorization, it was progressive development of perceptual capacities. Students learned to enter trance states, to journey in vision, to receive knowledge from non-ordinary sources. The technique involved specific combinations of sensory deprivation, rhythmic chanting, plant medicine, and exposure to natural energy sites at optimal times, under controlled conditions, following precise protocols refined over generations. Druidic students reportedly developed abilities that seemed impossible by ordinary standards. When the Romans and later the Church destroyed Druidic training systems, they didn't just suppress a religion. They eliminated a technology for consciousness development that had been refined over centuries. Some of it survived in fragmented form. Meditation techniques taught by Christian mystics bear suspicious resemblance to Druidic practices. Certain Catholic contemplative orders preserve breathing and visualization methods that seem Celtic in origin. But the systematic training program, the complete technology, was lost. Or was it? Because here's where things get interesting. In the Vatican archives exist documents related to the conversion of Celtic territories, reports from missionaries describing practices they encountered, strategies for countering Druidic influence, records of debates about which Celtic practices could be absorbed versus which must be condemned. Some of these documents remain classified. Access is restricted even to scholars with general permission to study the archives. The official explanation is that they contain sensitive historical information that might offend modern Irish or Scottish Catholics. But what if they contain something else? What if early church authorities documented Druidic practices in detail, including techniques that worked, that produced real results, that the church wanted to monopolize rather than eliminate? There are hints of this in medieval Christian mysticism. Certain contemplative practices taught in monasteries, visualization of light, union with cosmic consciousness, prophetic vision, sound suspiciously similar to what Roman sources describe of Druidic training. What if the Church didn't destroy all Druidic knowledge, but rather absorbed the effective techniques, reframed them within Christian theology, and restricted access to church initiates? This would explain why contemplative Christian mysticism developed most richly in areas with strongest Celtic heritage: Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany. The practices were already there. The Church just claimed them and renamed them. The concept of thin places in Celtic spirituality particularly reveals deep understanding. Druids identified specific locations where the boundary between physical and spiritual seemed naturally weak. Certain hills, wells, groves, crossroads. Modern geophysics has discovered that some of these sites show unusual electromagnetic properties. Underground water flows, mineral deposits, geological faults, all can create measurable energy anomalies. The Druids somehow identified these locations without instruments, purely through direct perception. They built no temples in the Roman sense. Instead, they marked thin places and conducted rituals there, working with the natural energy rather than constructing artificial structures. This represents a fundamentally different approach to sacred space. Romans and later Christians built temples to create holiness. Druids found holiness already present in nature and honored it where it existed. When the Church built churches on Celtic sacred sites, they weren't just claiming territory. They were appropriating locations the Druids had already identified as energetically powerful. The Church recognized that these places worked. People felt something there. So they claimed the locations while destroying the knowledge of why they worked. Perhaps the most suppressed Druidic knowledge concerned death and the afterlife. Celtic cosmology held that death was not an ending but a transition. The soul continued in another realm, the other world, which was not distant but parallel, separated only by a thin membrane. This directly contradicted Christian teaching about death, leading to judgment and permanent assignment to heaven or hell. The Celtic view suggested ongoing connection between living and dead, the possibility of communication and of an eventual rebirth. Early Christian missionaries in Celtic lands struggled with this. They couldn't simply declare it false because people had experiences that seemed to confirm it. On Samhain, particularly, the sense of the dead being near was too widespread, too consistent across the population, so the church reframed it. The dead weren't returning on their own. Demons were masquerading as beloved ancestors. Any communication with the dead was necromancy and forbidden. The only acceptable prayers for the dead were those channeled through church ritual on All Souls' Day. This severed the direct connection that Celtic spirituality maintained. No longer could you speak to grandmother directly when the veil thinned. Now you needed a priest to intercede, church blessing to make it safe, official church dates and methods. What had been natural became supernatural. What had been accessible became controlled. But the Druids' knowledge about death consciousness, about what happens to awareness during the dying process, about how the departed could be contacted, about the nature of the other world itself, was systematically suppressed rather than simply dismissed. Why suppress what you consider false? You suppress what threatens because it might be true. The Druids also understood something about collective consciousness that modern civilization is only rediscovering. They recognized that groups of people, properly attuned, could achieve states of awareness impossible for individuals alone. Druidic gatherings at major festivals weren't just social events. They were consciousness experiments. When entire communities gathered at Samhain, when everyone focused intention on the thinning veil simultaneously, when hundreds of voices chanted together, something happened. Modern research on collective meditation, on synchronized neural activity in groups, on the measurable effects of mass intention suggests the Druids might have been right. Consciousness isn't purely individual. Under the right conditions, groups can achieve coherent mental states with observable effects. This knowledge threatened the church immensely. If spiritual power could be accessed through collective practice, if communities could achieve altered states together, if ordinary people gathering on specific dates could reliably contact other realms, then hierarchical religious authority became unnecessary. The church's response was to maintain ritual gathering but completely control its content. Mass became the acceptable form of collective spiritual practice, but only with priests leading, only following church-approved liturgy, only on church-designated dates. The wild, ecstatic, unpredictable aspects of Celtic collective ritual were condemned as demonic. Order, hierarchy, control replaced spontaneity, direct experience, and collective empowerment. What's perhaps most remarkable is how much Druidic knowledge we've lost without knowing what we lost. Because they wrote nothing down, because the church suppressed what survived, because even folk practices faded over centuries, we now have only shadows of what they knew. We know they had it because the evidence remains. Stone circles aligned with astronomical precision, calendar systems matching modern calculations, sites identified as energetically significant that modern instruments confirm as unusual, herbal preparations that modern science validates as pharmacologically active. They knew things, real things, useful things, things that worked, and all of it was suppressed, condemned, destroyed, not because it was false, but because it was true and accessible without church mediation. The tragedy isn't just historical, it's ongoing. Because that knowledge about natural cycles, about consciousness, about death, about how to live in harmony with the land and the cosmos would be useful now. We're rediscovering some of it through science, measuring geomagnetic variations, documenting seasonal effects on consciousness, studying plant medicine, investigating collective mental states. But we're doing it slowly, expensively, through institutions, when the Druids had already worked it out through generations of direct observation. What if the Vatican archives contained detailed records of Druidic practices? What if early missionaries documented everything before destroying it? What if there are manuscripts describing in precise detail how the Druids measured time, identified power places, trained consciousness, communed with the dead. And what if those documents remained classified because they reveal that Celtic spirituality was based on real, replicable, teachable techniques for accessing states of consciousness and working with natural energies that the Church wanted to monopolize? The suppression of Druidic knowledge wasn't about destroying falsehood, it was about controlling access to truth. And that truth that nature has rhythms, that consciousness can be trained, that the veil really does thin, that the dead remain connected to the living, survives despite suppression. It survives in Halloween practices we perform without understanding. It survives in the way October 31st still feels different. It survives in the instinct that draws people to celebrate this night in ways the Church never quite controlled. The Druids are gone, their training systems destroyed, their knowledge scattered, but Samhain remains, because Samhain was never invented. It was observed, and what's observed in nature continues, whether anyone remembers the original observers or not. The Church's campaign against Halloween and Celtic spiritual practices wasn't passive neglect or gentle persuasion. It was systematic, calculated, and at times violent. Understanding this requires looking at specific historical moments when the Church actively worked to eliminate practices they couldn't transform. The persecution began early. By the 5th century, as Christianity consolidated power across former Roman territories, Church councils started issuing specific condemnations of pagan remnants. These weren't abstract theological statements. They were practical instructions to priests about what to forbid, what to punish, and how to identify dangerous practices among their congregations. The Council of Arles in 452 AD condemned people who dressed as animals or old women on January 1st, a clear reference to Celtic costume traditions that had been shifted from Samhain to New Year's celebrations, but the penalty wasn't mild. Those caught could face public penance, exclusion from communion, or in severe cases, excommunication. By the 6th century, the condemnations became more specific. The Council of Auxerre in 578 AD explicitly forbade celebrating the pagan New Year with offerings, fires, and divination. Priests were instructed to identify anyone in their parish who continued these practices and report them to church authorities. But the real escalation came in the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Church's power solidified and resistance to conversion persisted in rural Celtic areas. This is when we see the first documented cases of people being executed for maintaining Samhain traditions. The records are fragmentary, often preserved only in monastic chronicles that mention punishments in passing, but they paint a clear picture. In 743 AD, a woman in what's now southern France was burned alive for conjuring spirits on the Feast of the Dead. The specific date isn't mentioned, but the timing, autumn, Feast of the Dead, strongly suggests Samhain observance. In 816 AD, Irish annals record the execution of a man accused of Druidic practices contrary to Christ. His crime? Lighting bonfires on hilltops and making offerings to ancestors. Practices that had been Celtic tradition for millennia were now capital offenses. The Church justified this violence through a theological framework that classified any non-Christian spiritual practice as demon worship. It wasn't that Celtic practices were merely wrong or misguided. They were actively evil, gateways for demons to enter the world. This framing was crucial. It meant that tolerance equaled spiritual danger. A priest who ignored Samhain celebrations in his parish wasn't being merciful. He was allowing Satan to operate unchecked. This created enormous pressure on local clergy to actively persecute rather than simply discourage. The most systematic suppression campaign came with the medieval witch hunts, which peaked between the 15th and 17th centuries. While these are usually associated with accusations of malevolent magic, the reality is more complex. Many people executed as witches were actually practitioners of folk traditions descending from pre-Christian Celtic and Germanic spirituality. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 and used as a witch-hunting manual for centuries, contains revealing passages. It condemns people who observe the old calendar, who make offerings on certain nights, who speak to the dead on their appointed days. These aren't descriptions of devil worship. They're descriptions of people maintaining ancient seasonal practices. One particularly telling section warns against women who gather herbs at improper times by the light of the moon and mutter words not from Scripture. This is botanical medicine combined with Celtic moon phase timing. But the Malleus presents it as witchcraft punishable by death. How many people died for maintaining Halloween-related traditions? We'll never know precisely. Witch trial records are incomplete, often destroyed, sometimes never written. But conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands were executed across Europe, with accusations frequently involving seasonal observances, divination, and communication with the dead, all core Samhain practices. In Celtic areas particularly, the persecution targeted specific knowledge holders, the wise women who knew herbal medicine, who attended births, who helped the dying. These were often repositories of pre-Christian wisdom. They knew which plants to harvest when. They understood natural cycles. They maintained traditions from before the church arrived. The church systematically eliminated them, not all at once, not through single dramatic campaigns, but steadily, over centuries, through trials that accused them of impossible crimes, flying through the air, transforming into animals, cursing crops. The real crime was knowing too much about the old ways, and the punishment was fire. But the church didn't rely only on violence. They also deployed sophisticated propaganda to make Celtic practices seem dangerous and foolish rather than sacred. Church sermons from the medieval period consistently portrayed Halloween-related customs as invitations to disaster. Stories circulated about people who celebrated Samhain and suffered terrible fates, possessed by demons, driven mad, struck dead. These cautionary tales reinforced the message: the old ways bring only suffering. Art played a role too. Medieval manuscripts illustrating calendar customs show October-November celebrations with demons lurking in corners, skeletal figures representing death, frightening imagery designed to make viewers associate these practices with damnation. Church-approved mystery plays performed during festivals included scenes showing what happened to those who consulted with the dead or practiced divination. Actors portraying such characters would be dragged off by devil costume performers amid theatrical flames and screams. This wasn't neutral documentation of customs. It was deliberate conditioning to make people fear and reject their own traditions. The church also worked to disrupt the social structures that transmitted Celtic knowledge. Extended families living in the same area for generations could pass down practices orally, so the church encouraged mobility, convinced young people to move to cities where monasteries dominated, promoted marriage alliances that broke up traditional clan structures. Monastic education was particularly effective at disruption. Promising young men from Celtic families were recruited into monasteries where they learned Latin, Christian theology, and contempt for pagan customs. When they returned to their communities, if they returned, they'd been thoroughly conditioned to view their ancestors' practices as shameful. Women faced similar pressure. Convents recruited girls from families still maintaining old traditions. The girls would be educated in Christian devotion and taught that their grandmother's wisdom was demonic delusion. This created generational breaks where knowledge couldn't be transmitted. The church's campaign also included rewriting history to delegitimize Celtic culture entirely. Monastic chronicles describing pre-Christian Celtic society portrayed it as primitive, violent, backward. The Druids were described as bloodthirsty priests performing human sacrifice. Celtic festivals were characterized as drunken orgies. Some of this was true. The Celts did practice human sacrifice in some contexts, and their festivals included feasting and intoxication. But the church's accounts were deliberately one-sided, emphasizing violence while ignoring sophisticated astronomy, complex law systems, and rich oral literature. By painting pre-Christian Celtic society as barbaric, the church made its own suppression of Celtic practices seem like civilization defeating savagery rather than one knowledge system crushing another. This historical distortion had lasting effects. Even today, popular understanding of the Celts emphasizes warfare and superstition while downplaying their genuine achievements in astronomy, metallurgy, law, and agriculture. The The church also used economic pressure. In medieval society, full participation in economic life required good standing with the church. Anyone publicly maintaining Celtic practices risked being denied Christian burial, excluded from trade guilds, or barred from holding property. Parish records tracked who attended church on All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Those who didn't show up faced questions. Those who were seen lighting bonfires on October 31st or leaving food for the dead risked being reported to church authorities. This created enormous pressure to at least appear to abandon old practices. People might secretly maintain traditions within their homes, but public celebration became impossible. Yet despite all this, the executions, the propaganda, the social pressure, the economic coercion, Celtic practices survived. They went underground. They adapted. They disguised themselves. But they didn't die. This tells us something important. If suppression had been based purely on superior knowledge or obviously better alternatives, it would have worked completely. People would have voluntarily abandoned ineffective practices for more effective ones. But that's not what happened. The church had to maintain active suppression for centuries because the practices kept resurging. This suggests they served real needs, produced real results, connected to real experiences that official Christianity didn't adequately address. The church's own documents reveal this frustration. Church councils in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries all issued fresh condemnations of the same practices: bonfires on October 31st, offerings to the dead, divination, costume wearing. If previous condemnations had worked, new ones wouldn't have been necessary. The repeated prohibitions prove that people kept doing what the church told them not to do. Even today, Vatican documents classify certain folk practices as incompatible with Christian faith. A 2003 document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith warns against divination, magic, and spiritism, the same practices condemned in medieval councils. The campaign continues, just with different methods. No more burnings, no more executions, but persistent messaging that directs spiritual experience, communication with the dead, and working with natural cycles are dangerous, forbidden, demonic. What might be in the restricted Vatican archives related to all this? We can speculate based on what's known. First, detailed accounts from early missionary work in Celtic territories, reports describing exactly what practices missionaries encountered and exactly how they were instructed to counter them. These would reveal the Church's strategic thinking about transformation versus suppression. Second, records of trials and executions for maintaining Celtic practices. These would document the human cost of Christianization, showing how many people died for refusing to abandon Samhain and related observances. Third, captured or confiscated texts. When the Church raided communities maintaining old traditions, they would have seized whatever written materials existed: herb lore, astronomical calculations, ritual instructions. Rather than destroy everything, some items were likely archived for church scholars to study, understand, and counter. Fourth, internal debates among church authorities about how to handle persistent Celtic practices. Not all church leaders agreed on strategy. Some advocated gentler approaches, others demanded harsh suppression. Documents recording these debates would reveal how divided the church actually was. Fifth, admissions that certain Celtic practices produced real results that Christianity couldn't explain. These would be the most sensitive, acknowledgments that divination sometimes worked, that the veil really did thin, that practices the church condemned as demonic actually connected people to genuine spiritual experiences. These documents would never be made public because they would undermine the church's historical narrative. The story the church tells is one of enlightened Christianity replacing primitive paganism. Documents showing systematic violence, strategic manipulation, and grudging admission that pagan practices worked would complicate that story considerably. In recent decades, as Ireland and Scotland have experienced renewed interest in Celtic heritage, some church officials have softened their rhetoric. There's acknowledgement that pre-Christian Celtic culture had value, that not everything was demonic, that some traditions can be appreciated historically. But this softening comes with careful boundaries. You can study Celtic culture academically. You can appreciate Celtic art. You can even acknowledge that Celtic festivals mark natural seasonal transitions. What you cannot do, according to church teaching, is actually practice Celtic spirituality. That remains forbidden. Divination is still condemned. Communication with the dead is still classified as necromancy. Samhain as spiritual practice rather than historical curiosity is still incompatible with Christianity. This reveals that the suppression campaign hasn't ended. It's just evolved. The methods are gentler, but the core message remains. Direct spiritual experience outside church mediation is dangerous and wrong. The church still fears what it feared 1,500 years ago, that people might discover they don't need priests to access the sacred, that the natural world contains its own wisdom, that death isn't the theological problem Christianity makes it, that the veil really does thin, with or without church permission. Halloween survived this centuries-long campaign because it connected to something the church couldn't eliminate, the actual thinning of the veil that occurs each autumn, the genuine human need to honor the dead, the observable reality of seasonal transitions. The church could rename it, reframe it, threaten people who celebrated it traditionally, but they couldn't make October 31st stop being the threshold it is. They couldn't prevent the dead from drawing near. They couldn't eliminate the instinct to mark this night as different, sacred, charged with possibility. The campaign suppressed knowledge. It killed people. It destroyed texts. It severed transmission lines, but it failed to eliminate what it most feared, the direct experience of the thin veil that returns every year, regardless of what any church says about it. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Vatican Secret Archive until the name change in 2019, stretches across 53 miles of shelving. That's not an exaggeration. 53 linear miles of documents, manuscripts, letters, papal bulls, trial records, diplomatic correspondence, and materials the Catholic Church has accumulated over nearly 2 millennia. Most of it is mundane. Baptismal records from obscure parishes, financial accounts from medieval monasteries, letters between bishops about administrative matters, the everyday bureaucracy of running a global institution for centuries. But buried within that ocean of paperwork, restricted behind additional layers of access requirements, exist materials the Church has never wanted widely examined, documents that remain classified not because they're fragile or historically insignificant, but because they contain information that complicates the official narrative. What might exist in those restricted sections related to Halloween, Samhain, and Celtic spirituality specifically? Based on what we know about church record-keeping practices, missionary work documentation, and the suppression campaigns described earlier, we can construct a reasonable picture. First, there would be detailed missionary reports from the conversion period. When Christian missionaries entered Celtic territories between the 5th and 10th centuries, they sent regular updates to Rome describing what they encountered and how conversion efforts were progressing. These reports weren't vague. Medieval church bureaucracy was thorough. Missionaries would have documented specific practices they observed, the timing of festivals, the nature of rituals, the role of druids, the beliefs about death and the afterlife. They would have described which approaches worked in converting populations and which failed. They would have reported on resistance they encountered and strategies they developed to overcome it. Most importantly, they would have documented practices that produced results the Church couldn't explain within Christian theology. Because if something worked, if divination on Samhain night proved accurate, if communication with the dead seemed genuine, if the thin veil produced observable effects, missionaries needed guidance on how to respond. These reports would be extraordinarily valuable today. They would contain detailed ethnographic information about Celtic spirituality from observers who actually witnessed it, recorded before centuries of suppression erased the practices from living memory. But they would also contain admissions the Church can't afford to make publicly. Admissions that Celtic practices sometimes worked, that people experienced genuine spiritual encounters through non-Christian means, that the choice to suppress rather than simply dismiss these practices was based on recognizing their efficacy. Such documents likely exist. Missionary work generated extensive paperwork. The Church archived everything. But access to materials from the conversion period remains tightly controlled, particularly documents related to pagan practices and their elimination. Second, there would be records from church councils and synods that issued specific prohibitions against Halloween-related practices. We know these councils occurred. Historians have identified numerous instances where church authorities condemned Celtic observances, but the surviving public records are often brief. A council would issue a decree: no Christian shall participate in pagan New Year celebrations with bonfires and offerings. We know the prohibition happened, but not the discussion behind it. The full council records, the debates among church leaders about how to handle persistent Celtic practices, the disagreements about strategy, the justifications offered for suppression, those would be in the archives. These would reveal that church authorities weren't unified in their approach. Some advocated gentler methods, gradual transformation, selective absorption of practices. Others demanded harsh suppression and punishment for anyone maintaining old ways. The documents would show church leaders explicitly strategizing about how to control populations through calendar manipulation, how to redirect spiritual energy from Celtic festivals to Christian holy days, how to make people afraid of their own traditions. This level of calculated cultural manipulation, laid out in Church Fathers' own words, would be devastating to the narrative that Christianization was a benign process of enlightenment replacing superstition. Third, there would be trial records from prosecutions related to maintaining Celtic practices. Not all witch trial records survive, but the Church kept meticulous accounts of proceedings, especially when high-profile cases involved accusations of practicing the old religion. These records would document exactly what people were accused of doing, and often, the accusations would reveal authentic Celtic practices, gathering herbs at specific moon phases, leaving offerings on particular dates, speaking to the dead on Samhain, performing divination rituals. The trial testimony would preserve descriptions of these practices from the accused themselves. People explaining why they did, what they believed, what their grandmothers taught them. Fragments of living Celtic tradition, captured in hostile court records before being violently suppressed. These documents would also reveal the flimsiness of many prosecutions. People executed for practices that were traditional healing methods or simple seasonal observances, prosecuted as demon worship because the Church needed to eliminate knowledge it couldn't control. Publishing these records in full would force acknowledgement of how many people the Church killed for maintaining indigenous European spiritual traditions, the human cost of suppressing Halloween's Celtic origins. Fourth, there would be confiscated materials, texts, artifacts, ritual objects seized when communities maintaining old practices were raided. When church authorities moved against a village still celebrating Samhain traditionally, they wouldn't just punish people. They'd confiscate anything related to the practices: herbal preparations, carved objects used in rituals, any written materials, however fragmentary, rather than destroy everything immediately. Some items would be sent to church scholars for examination. The Church needed to understand what they were fighting. They needed to know if practices could be co-opted or if they required complete elimination. These confiscated materials would be archived, stored away, classified, forgotten by most people but preserved nonetheless. They would include genuine Druidic artifacts, or at least objects used in Druidic descended practices by people who maintained the traditions orally. They would include herbal formularies showing Celtic plant knowledge. They would include crude astronomical calculations showing how people tracked the calendar without church approval. Most remarkably, they might include oral traditions that were finally written down in extremis by elders facing death who chose to break the taboo against writing in hopes that something would survive. These would be the closest thing to actual Druidic texts, captured at the last moment before complete suppression. Fifth, there would be internal church documents discussing how to handle the persistence of Celtic practices despite suppression efforts. Because the practices didn't die, the repeated condemnations prove that. So church authorities would have ongoing correspondence about the Halloween problem, why people kept celebrating it in unauthorized ways, what could be done to stop it, whether the current approach was working. These documents would reveal frustration, confusion about why practices persisted despite punishment, grudging acknowledgement that Celtic observances met needs official Christianity didn't address. They would show church leaders struggling with the fact that transforming Samhain into All Hallows' Eve worked only partially. The Christian overlay took hold in cities and among educated classes, but rural populations maintained hybrid practices that bothered church authorities for centuries. Some documents might propose new strategies. Others might acknowledge defeat on certain points, conceding that bonfires on October 31st couldn't be completely eliminated, so perhaps they could be blessed and claimed as Christian rather than fought endlessly. This would reveal the Church's flexibility when absolute control proved impossible, the willingness to reframe rather than continue losing battles, the pragmatic calculation that letting people have some practices, rebranded, was better than maintaining prohibitions that everyone ignored. Sixth, there would be documents related to calendar manipulation specifically. The creation of All Saints' Day and its movement to November 1st wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The archive would contain the actual discussions about this, church leaders debating which date would most effectively compete with Samhain, how to make the Christian alternative appealing, what elements of Celtic practice could be absorbed versus eliminated. These would show the Church consciously designing religious holidays to suppress competing observances, calculating the psychology of conversion, manipulating sacred time to control populations. The documents might include rejected proposals, ideas about how to handle Samhain that church leaders discussed but decided against. Maybe some advocated complete prohibition with harsh penalties. Maybe others suggested fully absorbing it, making Samhain itself Christian. Seeing the strategic options church leaders considered and rejected would reveal how deliberately they approached cultural suppression. Seventh, and perhaps most sensitive, there would be documents admitting that Celtic spiritual practices produced real effects. Because here's what the Church could never publicly acknowledge: some of what they condemned as demonic actually worked. Divination on Samhain night yielded accurate results often enough that church authorities took it seriously as a threat, not a joke. Communication with the dead produced experiences convincing enough that people risked execution rather than stop. The thin veil was real enough that even Christian observers felt it. If these things were purely imaginary, if Celtic practices were completely ineffective, the Church could have simply let them die naturally. People would have noticed they didn't work and abandoned them. But the practices persisted because they worked, and church documents likely contain private acknowledgments of this, discussions among bishops and theologians about how to explain phenomena that Celtic spirituality predicted and Christianity denied. These documents might discuss whether the effects were demonic deception or something else, whether the thin veil was Satan's trickery or an actual feature of reality the Church needed to control, whether Druidic understanding of natural cycles reflected genuine knowledge or clever observations falsely attributed to spirits. Whatever conclusions they reached, the documents would reveal that church authorities took Celtic spirituality seriously as a competing system that produced results, not as primitive superstition easily dismissed. Finally, there might be something even more remarkable: preserved fragments of actual Druidic knowledge that the Church captured and kept. When the last Druids died or converted, when the final elders who maintained oral traditions passed away, some of that knowledge might have been recorded by sympathetic Christian monks who valued it, by church scholars studying what they fought, by converts who couldn't bear to let everything die. These fragments, herbal formulas, astronomical observations, seasonal timing calculations, consciousness techniques might exist in the archives, classified as historical curiosities or pagan superstitions. Preserved but not publicized, they would be invaluable. They would represent the closest thing to authentic Druidic wisdom surviving anywhere. And they would confirm that Celtic spirituality was based on sophisticated observation of natural phenomena, not primitive fear. Publishing them would validate what the Church has spent centuries denying: that pre-Christian Celtic culture possessed genuine knowledge, that their spiritual practices connected to real patterns in nature, that what was suppressed wasn't ignorance but a competing understanding of reality. Will any of this ever be released? The Church has been gradually opening the archives over the past century. Materials once completely restricted have become available to scholars. The process continues, with new tranches of documents released periodically. But release is selective. The most sensitive materials remain classified. Access requires special permission rarely granted. And even when documents are technically available, they're often in Latin or medieval languages, filed under obscure categories, practically invisible unless you know exactly what you're looking for. The Church has acknowledged past mistakes in some areas, apologizing for the treatment of Galileo, expressing regret about the Inquisition. But acknowledging the systematic suppression of Celtic spirituality would be different. It would mean admitting that Halloween has roots the Church deliberately obscured, that Celtic practices were suppressed not because they were false, but because they were true and accessible without church mediation. That indigenous European spirituality was violently eliminated to establish Christian monopoly. That's a confession the Church isn't ready to make, so the documents remain locked away, accessible only to those who already know not to ask dangerous questions. But their existence means the truth is preserved, waiting. In 53 miles of shelving, in restricted sections, in materials classified as too sensitive for general access, the evidence exists. The question is whether it will remain hidden until everyone who might care has forgotten to ask, or whether eventually the archives will open fully, and the documented history of how the Church suppressed Halloween's true origins will finally come to light. In 2023, Americans spent over $12 billion on Halloween. That's more than many countries' entire GDP. Halloween is now the second largest commercial holiday in the United States, trailing only Christmas. Walk through any American city in October and you'll see the transformation. Houses draped in cobwebs, skeletons hanging from trees, entire neighborhoods coordinating elaborate displays, costume shops doing months of business in weeks, candy manufacturers producing billions of pieces of product. The irony is almost too perfect. The festival the Church spent centuries suppressing, the practices they condemned as demonic, the spiritual traditions they violently eliminated, all of it is returned as America's second favorite holiday. And the Church can't do anything about it, because Halloween in modern America operates in a space the medieval Church never anticipated, commercial capitalism wrapped in secular entertainment. It's not presented as religion or spirituality, it's just fun. But harmless seasonal celebration. Who could object to children getting candy? But underneath the commercialization, underneath the playful imagery, the original patterns persist. Every year, on October 31st, millions of Americans unknowingly perform rituals with Celtic origins. They don't think of it as spiritual practice. They think of it as tradition, as entertainment, as what you do on Halloween, which makes it even more powerful, because it's no longer contested. The Church lost the battle so completely that Halloween is now normalized, accepted, woven into American culture so thoroughly that questioning it seems absurd. Consider what actually happens on Halloween night in America. Children dress in costumes, Celtic camouflage against spirits. They go door to door collecting offerings. Celtic appeasement of the dead transformed into trick-or-treating. Jack-o'-lanterns glow on porches, Celtic protective lights marking thresholds. Plastic skeletons and ghost decorations acknowledge death's presence, Celtic recognition of the thinning veil. Strip away the commercial veneer and you're looking at millions of people performing a Celtic seasonal ritual. They don't know that's what they're doing, but structurally, symbolically, it's the same practice Celts performed 2,000 years ago on Samhain. The Church managed to rename it. They managed to reframe it. They managed to make people forget the original meaning. But they couldn't kill the practice itself. And now, it's bigger than ever. Celebrated more widely than All Saints' Day ever was, this represents a profound failure of the Church's suppression campaign. After centuries of violence, propaganda, and cultural manipulation, the very festival they tried to eliminate has become embedded in American life more deeply than most Catholic holy days. But there's something even more significant happening. In recent decades, particularly among younger generations, there's been a revival of interest in Halloween's actual origins. People are discovering the Celtic roots. They're learning about Samhain. They're exploring what the festival originally meant. And they're finding it resonates in ways official Christianity often doesn't. Because Samhain addresses something Christianity struggles with, death itself. Not as theological problem requiring salvation, but as natural transition deserving acknowledgement. The Celtic approach, honoring the dead, Maintaining connection with ancestors, recognizing death as part of life's cycle, speaks to people in ways church teachings about heaven and hell don't always reach. Halloween provides space for this. You can light a candle for deceased loved ones on Halloween night without it being religious. You can feel their presence without claiming supernatural intervention. You can acknowledge the liminal quality of late October without joining a church. This is what the church originally feared: direct spiritual experience outside institutional control. And it's exactly what's happening as people rediscover Halloween's origins. Social media has accelerated this. TikTok videos explaining Samhain traditions get millions of views. Instagram posts about Celtic spirituality gather huge followings. Online communities form around practicing Samhain as spiritual observance rather than just commercial holiday. The Church notices. Vatican documents from recent decades express concern about neo-pagan practices, about young people being drawn to pre-Christian spirituality, about Halloween being used as entry point for beliefs incompatible with Christianity. But they can't suppress it the way medieval authorities could. You can't execute people for TikTok posts about Celtic traditions. You can't burn books when the information is distributed digitally. You can't control the narrative when millions of sources exist outside church authority. The information age has done what centuries of suppression couldn't be undone. It's made the knowledge accessible again. And what people are discovering isn't the demonic practices the church described. They're finding sophisticated seasonal observances, astronomical knowledge, understanding of natural cycles, practices for processing grief and maintaining connection with the dead. They're finding that the pagan superstitions the church condemned were actually useful, meaningful, grounded in observable reality. This creates a problem for the church that's only growing. Because once people recognize that Halloween has deeper origins, they start asking what else has been hidden, reframed, or misrepresented. They start questioning other holidays, other practices, the entire narrative of Christian uniqueness. Christmas at winter solstice, Easter at spring equinox, saints replacing local deities, holy wells that were sacred before Christianity, churches built on pre-Christian sacred sites, the pattern becomes visible. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is why recovering Halloween's true history matters. It's not just about one holiday. It's about recognizing how systematically indigenous European spirituality was suppressed and how much of what we think is purely Christian actually has pre-Christian roots. It's about reclaiming our actual cultural heritage rather than the sanitized version the church approved. For Americans specifically, this has additional significance because American Halloween is unique. When Irish and Scottish immigrants brought their traditions to the United States in the 19th century, they encountered a country with different religious dynamics than Europe. America had no state church, no unified religious authority. Denominational diversity and constitutional separation of church and state meant no single institution could dictate which practices were acceptable. So Halloween evolved differently in America than in Europe. It retained more folk elements. It became more openly celebratory. The church couldn't suppress it as effectively, so it flourished in ways it couldn't elsewhere. Modern American Halloween represents what the festival might have become without church interference: vibrant, community-focused, embracing rather than fearing the liminal qualities of late October. This makes American Halloween a kind of living preservation of traditions that were more successfully suppressed in Europe. The commercial aspects are uniquely American, but the underlying structure, the costumes, the offerings, the acknowledgement of death, the celebration of threshold time, these remain Celtic. And now, as Americans become more aware of these origins, they're not abandoning Halloween. They're enriching it, adding elements of historical accuracy, performing Samhain observances intentionally rather than unconsciously, reclaiming it as spiritual practice while maintaining the fun aspects. This hybrid approach, honoring both the ancient spiritual dimensions and the modern cultural traditions, creates something the church never anticipated: a widely celebrated holiday that serves both secular and spiritual functions without requiring institutional religious authority. You can celebrate Halloween as pure entertainment. You can also use it as occasion for genuine spiritual practice, honoring ancestors, acknowledging death, working with threshold energies. Or you can do both. The flexibility makes it accessible while preserving depth for those who seek it. This represents a complete inversion of what the Church attempted. They wanted to control access to spiritual experience through institutional gatekeeping. Halloween in modern America offers spiritual access to anyone, regulated by nothing but personal choice. The commercialization that seems to cheapen Halloween actually protects it. Because it's commercial, it's beyond church control. Capitalism doesn't care about theology. If people buy Halloween merchandise, companies produce it. If communities want to celebrate, they do. Market forces override religious authority. This creates space for the practices to persist and evolve without institutional permission. It also means Halloween continues adapting. New elements get added: Mexican Day of the Dead influences, horror movie aesthetics, creative costume innovations. But the core remains, marking October 31st as special, acknowledging death and spirits, performing rituals of threshold time. The Church's suppression campaign failed so completely that the holiday they tried to eliminate is now culturally stronger than the Christian replacement they created. More Americans celebrate Halloween than All Saints' Day. More people can explain Halloween traditions than Catholic theology about the communion of saints. The living practice defeated the institutional attempt at control. What does this mean going forward? Several possibilities emerge. First, continued revival of Samhain as conscious spiritual practice. As more people discover the Celtic origins, more will choose to celebrate with full awareness of what they're doing and why. This creates genuine connection to ancestral traditions without requiring adherence to Reconstructionist pagan religions. Second, integration of Celtic wisdom into broader spiritual seeking. The Druidic understanding of natural cycles, of death as transition, of the thinning veil, these concepts work within many spiritual frameworks, not just Celtic reconstruction. People integrate them into eclectic personal practice. Third, ongoing challenge to church narratives. Every person who learns Halloween's real history becomes slightly more skeptical of official church claims about cultural uniqueness. This erosion of narrative authority continues, accelerating as information spreads. Fourth, recovery of other suppressed traditions. Halloween serves as gateway. Once people recognize one suppressed practice, they start looking for others. This leads to broader interest in pre-Christian European spirituality generally. The Church's attempt to hide Halloween's origins ultimately failed, and in failing, it opened doors to questioning everything else the Church has claimed about history, about spirituality, about authority itself. This is why recovering Halloween's truth matters today. Not because everyone needs to become neo-pagan, not because Celtic spirituality is superior to other paths, but because recognizing what was hidden, what was suppressed, what was violently eliminated reveals patterns of institutional control that persist in other forms. It teaches us to question official narratives, to look for what's been obscured, to recognize when institutions claim unique authority over knowledge that actually belongs to everyone. Every jack-o'-lantern glowing on Halloween night is a small rebellion against that suppression. Every child in costume unknowingly honors traditions the Church tried to eliminate. Every piece of candy exchanged carries forward practices that survived centuries of persecution. The Celts understood something about the rhythm of the year that remains true whether anyone believes in their cosmology or not. October 31st is a threshold. The veil does thin. Death does draw near. These aren't religious beliefs. They're observable patterns in nature and consciousness. Halloween survived because it's rooted in that reality. And now that the truth about its origins is emerging again, it becomes even more powerful, not as commercial holiday or church-approved holy day, but as genuine acknowledgement of something real that happens each year when autumn dies into winter. The Vatican spent centuries hiding this truth, but hiding only works when information is scarce and authority is absolute. Neither condition applies anymore. The truth is out, and it's spreading. And every Halloween that passes strengthens it, as millions unknowingly practice what the Church claimed to have destroyed. We've traveled a long way together, from modern American Halloween parties back through 2,000 years of history, through the Celtic forests where druids watched the stars, through Roman conquests and Christian conversions, through medieval witch trials and Vatican archives, through suppression campaigns and cultural transformations. And we've arrived at a simple truth that changes everything. Halloween is not what we were told it was. It's not a harmless commercial holiday that emerged from nowhere. It's not a Christian observance created by the church. It's not even primarily about candy and costumes, though those elements now dominate. Halloween is the surviving remnant of a sophisticated Celtic spiritual practice that the church spent centuries trying to eliminate and failed. Every October 31st, when Americans carve pumpkins and dress in costumes and go trick-or-treating, they're participating in rituals that predate Christianity. Rituals designed to acknowledge the thinning veil between worlds. Rituals that honored death as transition rather than fearing it as ending. Rituals that maintained connection between the living and the dead without requiring priestly mediation. The church understood the threat this posed, not because Celtic practices were demonic, but because they were effective and accessible. They worked with observable natural phenomena, the seasonal transition from autumn to winter, the actual changes in electromagnetic fields, the genuine shift in consciousness that occurs in late October. So the church deployed every tool available: violence, propaganda, cultural manipulation, calendar overlay, demonization, historical revisionism. They killed people for maintaining Samhain traditions. They burned books and destroyed sacred sites. They condemned practices as witchcraft and executed knowledge holders. And still, Halloween survived. It survived because you can't suppress what's rooted in observable reality. The veil thins every year, whether anyone believes in it or not. October 31st marks a genuine threshold in the seasonal cycle regardless of theological frameworks. Death remains a universal human experience that demands acknowledgement. The practices survived because they met needs Christianity didn't fully address: the comfort of maintaining connection with deceased loved ones, the value of acknowledging death openly rather than hiding it behind theological abstractions, the power of marking seasonal transitions consciously. When Irish and Scottish immigrants brought their traditions to America, they found fertile ground, a country without unified religious authority, constitutional protection for diverse practices, commercial forces that cared more about profit than theology. Halloween exploded in America in ways it couldn't in Europe. It became huge, normalized, beloved. And now it's so deeply embedded in American culture that questioning it seems absurd. This represents a complete inversion of what the church attempted. They wanted to eliminate Celtic spiritual practices entirely. Instead, those practices now thrive in secular guise, celebrated more widely than the Christian overlay the church created. But what makes this truly significant isn't just that Halloween survived, it's what the survival reveals about everything else the church has claimed. Because once you recognize that Halloween has hidden Celtic origins, the church deliberately obscured, you start noticing the same pattern everywhere. Christmas at winter solstice, absorbing pagan traditions. Easter at spring equinox, incorporating fertility symbolism. Saints replacing local deities. Churches built on pre-Christian sacred sites. The entire edifice of Christian uniqueness starts crumbling. You realize Christianity didn't arrive with entirely new truth. It arrived and systematically absorbed, transformed, or suppressed what was already there. Indigenous European spirituality, Celtic, Germanic, Roman, Greek, possessed genuine wisdom about natural cycles, about consciousness, about death, about the relationship between humans and the cosmos. That wisdom was violently eliminated to establish Christian monopoly, but it never completely died. It survived in folk practices, in architectural symbolism, in festival structures, in the instincts and traditions people maintained despite church condemnation. And now, in the information age, it's resurging. People are discovering what was hidden. They're questioning official narratives. They're exploring pre-Christian European spirituality not as dusty history but as living practice. The church notices this resurgence and worries about it. Vatican documents express concern about neo-paganism, about young people being drawn away from Christianity, about Halloween serving as gateway to beliefs incompatible with Catholic teaching, but they can't suppress the information anymore. The internet has made knowledge accessible that was previously restricted to specialists. Social media spreads ideas faster than institutions can counter them. Communities form around shared interests regardless of geography or church approval. The secrets are coming out, and Halloween is leading the way because it's the most visible, most widely practiced surviving remnant of what the church tried to destroy. This matters because truth matters, not abstract theological truth, but historical truth about what actually happened, about which practices worked and why they were suppressed, about what knowledge was eliminated and who benefited from the elimination. It matters because understanding how the church suppressed Celtic spirituality teaches us to recognize similar patterns of institutional control elsewhere, to question narratives that claim unique authority, to investigate what's been hidden and why. It matters because the Druidic wisdom that was suppressed about natural cycles, about consciousness development, about death as transition, about direct spiritual experience remains relevant. We need that wisdom now, as we face ecological crisis and spiritual disconnection. The Celts understood something we've forgotten, that humans are part of natural cycles, not separate from them, that honoring those cycles keeps us in balance, that death isn't the enemy but part of the rhythm of existence. Halloween, stripped of commercialization, offers a doorway back to that understanding. It provides annual opportunity to acknowledge death, to honor ancestors, to work consciously with threshold time. You don't need to become a Reconstructionist pagan to access this. You don't need to reject all Christianity or adopt Celtic cosmology wholesale. You just need to recognize what Halloween actually is and engage with it intentionally. Light a candle for someone who died, actually mean it as honoring their memory and maintaining connection. Acknowledge that on this night, they feel closer somehow, not as theological claim but as actual experience. Notice how October 31st feels different. Pay attention to the quality of twilight, to the atmosphere, to your own consciousness. Recognize that something is happening, something the Celts observed and worked with. Understand that when you carve a jack-o'-lantern, you're participating in protective ritual technology developed over centuries of practice. When you wear a costume, you're employing Celtic spiritual camouflage. When you give out candy, you're making offerings at the threshold. These aren't just fun activities. They're the faded remnants of sophisticated spiritual practices that the Church condemned as demonic because they worked too well and required no priestly mediation. And in the Vatican archives, in restricted sections most scholars will never access, documents exist that prove the Church knew this. Reports from missionaries admitting Celtic practices produced real results. Trial records documenting people who maintained Samhain traditions and experienced genuine spiritual encounters. Internal debates about how to suppress knowledge the Church couldn't explain within Christian theology. Those documents will likely never be fully released. The Church has too much invested in its historical narrative to admit the systematic violence and manipulation used to establish Christian cultural dominance. But the truth exists anyway, not just in archives but in the practices themselves, in the Halloween traditions that survive, in the instinct that draws millions to celebrate this night. In the way October 31st still feels liminal, charged, different from other nights, the veil thins every year, regardless of belief systems or institutional claims. It's observable in nature, in consciousness, in the quality of this particular threshold time. The Celts knew this. They developed practices to work with it. The Church suppressed those practices but couldn't eliminate the underlying reality. And now, 2,000 years later, the truth is emerging again. Not because ancient texts were discovered, though some were. Not because church authorities decided to be honest, they haven't, but because observable reality persists despite suppression. October 31st remains a threshold. Death remains present. The dead remain connected to the living. These aren't religious beliefs requiring faith. They're experiences available to anyone who pays attention. Halloween provides the cultural container for acknowledging these experiences. And as people become more aware of Halloween's true origins, they can engage more consciously with what the festival actually offers. This is why the story of what the Vatican hides about Halloween matters. It's not just historical curiosity, it's recovery of suppressed wisdom that remains useful. It's recognition of how institutional power operates to control knowledge and narrative. It's doorway to questioning everything else we've been told without examining. The Church spent centuries hiding this truth. They killed people to keep it hidden. They burned books and destroyed evidence. They rewrote history and demonized alternatives. But truth has a way of surviving, sometimes in the oddest places, sometimes in the practices we perform without understanding why, sometimes in the commercial holiday we think is just about candy and costumes. Halloween is that truth, hiding in plain sight, waiting for people to recognize it, patient as the turning seasons. Every jack-o'-lantern you see this October is a Celtic protective ritual. Every costume is spiritual technology. Every piece of candy exchanged is an offering to the threshold between worlds. The Church renamed it, reframed it, claimed it, but they couldn't kill it, because you can't kill what's rooted in the actual rhythms of earth and sky. Life and death, summer and winter. The Celts observed those rhythms and honored them. The Church suppressed the observation and tried to control the honoring. But the rhythms continue, indifferent to theological frameworks, and so Samhain persists, under the name Halloween, in practices people think are secular but carry sacred origins, in the instinct that draws us to mark this night as different, special, charged with possibility. The Vatican's secret isn't hidden in documents, though some exist. It's hidden in the festival itself, in what Halloween actually is beneath the commercial surface. A doorway, a threshold. An annual thinning of the veil. The same thing the Celts observed 2,000 years ago. The same thing the Church spent centuries trying to suppress. Still here, still happening, still calling to anyone willing to notice. This Halloween, when you light your jack-o'-lantern, you're keeping alive a flame that has burned for 2 millennia despite every attempt to extinguish it. The Vatican may have hidden the documents, but they couldn't hide the truth that lives in the practices themselves. Some fires refuse to die. Some truths refuse to stay buried. And every October 31st, when the veil grows thin and the dead draw near and millions unknowingly perform Celtic rituals, that truth emerges again, patient, persistent, powerful, waiting for us to remember what we never completely forgot, that the sacred is accessible without permission, that death is part of life's rhythm, that certain nights hold more power than others, that the veil between worlds can thin. The Church tried to hide this. For centuries, they succeeded, but the information age has changed everything. The truth is emerging, the secrets are spreading, and Halloween leads the way, the festival that survived when everything else was suppressed, now revealing its origins to anyone curious enough to look. The Vatican feared this revelation. They still do. Because once people recognize Halloween's truth, they start questioning everything else. And that's when real awakening begins, not through what the Church teaches, but through what the seasons themselves reveal, year after year. Every October 31st, when the veil grows thin and truth rises from the shadows,